Abacus data is at it again on climate change. This is a critique of public concerns about climate, up 15 points since October 2024. Hi, I'm Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science Society. Abacus Data has issued a new poll on climate change, and they are saying that concerns about climate change are up 15 points since last October 2024. So I thought that we should have a look at this because if you recall, in 2018, Abacus Data and the Ecofiscal Commission did a very influential climate poll which helped push carbon pricing as a means of climate action. So I think it's important to keep an eye on these polls from Abacus and to always look at them with a critical eye. So let's have a look at that 2018 poll. Remember 2018? This is the list of public policy priorities from that poll. So top of the list obviously was improving health care, and then controlling government spending, deficits and debts, helping stimulate the creation of good quality jobs, keeping the cost of living from rising, reducing poverty and income inequality, ensuring housing is affordable. Like, these all sound like very contemporary concerns that Canadians have. And taking action to solve climate change was actually dead last on the list. And you can see here that they added together shifting our economy to a clean energy economy and improving the state of the environment. And somehow they came up with a poll that said that people were really interested in climate action. And this led to the Ecofiscal Commission coming up with Clearing the Air, how carbon pricing helps Canada fight climate change. And as we know from recent events, carbon pricing didn't help Canada fight climate change at all. It drove up the cost of living. It made life unbearable for small businesses who still have not received their carbon rebate that was promised to them and who are still rather in the dark as to whether that carbon rebate will also be taxed. So the first thing that Prime Minister Carney did when he got into office was to make the carbon price zero. He didn't cancel the program, he just made it zero. So at the present time, we're not feeling those effects, and he promised that he would impose higher carbon taxes on big industry. For instance, he suggested that Canadians don't buy steel in quantities, so the consumers wouldn't really feel it if the price on steel production went up. But in fact, everything that Canadian consumers buy that's of any substantive quality has some steel in it. So, how are these polls leading or misleading the public? So let's have a look at the newest poll. This is the header, Public Concerns About Climate, up 15 points since October 2024. And this is how the press sees it. The National Post is saying Canadians drastically downgrade climate as a priority, poll finds, as economic concerns escalate. And this person on Twitter is saying 68% say climate change is not a priority. That's great news. They're waking up. But here's how it looks. They asked what are the 3 most important issues facing Canada today. Please select 3 issues. And so the top 3 issues turned out to be the cost of living, Donald Trump and his administration, and the economy. Climate change and the environment, only 14%. And they do note that the poll was done before the Texas flooding. So Abacus is falsely trying to frame tragic floods as evidence of climate change. And where did this flood occur? Well, in a place known as Flash Flood Alley. Camp Mystic was built on a floodplain in Flash Flood Alley. So you can see a lot of material on Roger Pielke Jr.'s Twitter feed, also on his Substack called The Honest Broker. This is from the New York Post, and they're showing that the camps were right in close proximity to the river. Very tragic. So the point is, don't build on floodplains, and also have evacuation sirens for critical areas. And again, you can see the flooding was not unprecedented or unusual. These two researchers identified South Central Texas as being among the regions of the United States with the greatest risk of flooding. So nothing to do with climate change. These were catastrophic floods that have happened over the decades. And the Houston Chronicle affirms that Camp Mystic and others hit by deadly floods were built partly in extremely hazardous flood zones. Now you see here, there's a graphic below this, which you can go and look at the link, but you can see that the graphic is marking out the floodway, the 100-year floodplain, and the 500-year floodplain. So people often say, well, how can we have these 100-year floods over and over? It's important to have a look at the U.S. Geological Survey site and their discussion about the 100-year flood. It's really about statistical analysis. It's not a predictive time frame. So how can we have 200-year floods in less than 2 years? This question points out the importance of proper terminology. The term 100-year flood is used in an attempt to simplify the definition of a flood that statistically has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. Likewise, the term 100-year storm is used to define a rainfall event that statistically has this same 1% chance of occurring. In other words, over the course of 1 million years, these events would be expected to occur 10,000 times. But just because it rained 10 inches in one day last year doesn't mean it can't rain 10 inches in one day again this year. So I recommend that people read the whole thing and understand a 100-year flood doesn't mean there will only be a flood again in 100 years. Now, in the questions that Abacus data asked, for instance here, what is your level of concern about climate change and its potential impact on our future? So they do not differentiate between human-caused climate change and natural variability. And why is that an issue? Well, climate change can dramatically affect life. Like if we look back at the Little Ice Age, which preceded the present modern temperature record, life was horrible because global temperatures dropped dramatically. There were a lot of volcanoes that caused rapid cooling in certain periods of time. It was a grand solar minimum. Crops failed. The weather was extremely erratic. Dr. Sally Baliunas, who was our first scientific advisor, has a whole presentation on the Little Ice Age and how people used to burn witches at the stake for the crime of weather cooking with the help of Satan. And a lot of it sounds a lot like the witch hunts that are going on today from climate compliers against so-called climate deniers. Very superstitious actions made by the public and usually also by mobs. So it's important to understand that we were in a very cold period. There was a lot of famine. There were periods of years of rain in England. Years of rain, almost nonstop. This kind of also ushered in some of the bigger problems related to the Black Death. So, because the rats and mice sought a warmer place and they all came into the places where people lived, and their fleas then spread the Black Death, etc., etc. So I'm giving you a quick overview, but these are issues that a person who follows solar cycles today, which is a natural variability, They might be concerned that the new little ice age has started. And this is a paper from 2016 by Habibulov Abdusamatov. He's a senior researcher in Russia and is part of the Russian space station supervision. He's a very qualified researcher. And his view is that there is a new little ice age gradually coming in. So people might be very concerned about climate change because of natural causes. But really what Abacus data is trying to get at is human causation, because that's what the motivation is for this survey. Now, they asked, to what extent do you believe extreme weather events, floods, wildfires, and heat waves in Canada are becoming more frequent and severe? And they say that 65% of people believe that extreme events are becoming more severe. But science is not about belief, it's about evidence. And data, not opinions, should drive climate and energy policies. So once again, they ask, what specific changes or extreme weather events have you noticed in your area over the past 5 to 10 years? Select all that apply. So people seem to think that there's more wildfires or wildfire risk. And wildfire risk is a possibility because we have built out further into the forest in many locations. And that wildfire risk does increase the more that humans build out into the wilderness areas. But are there more wildfires? We'll look at the data. Are there unusual temperature fluctuations, extreme cold or hot spells? Are there more frequent heat waves, increased rainfall or flooding, stronger or more frequent storms like tornadoes and hurricanes, extended periods of drought, longer or harsher winters, higher than usual snowfall, no significant changes or events? Let's look and see. So if we look at the wildfire data, this is from the 2023 fire season. So based on the monthly fire starts in May, there seemed to be a few more, but the trend is not up. It was up for a bit and then it dropped down. And the same for July. Again, against the 10-year average trend, not really seeing a trend upward. Same for June, and likewise August, the trend is downward. And the number of fires and area burned in Canada by year, well, we had this anomaly year here. We had a number of weeks where we were trapped in kind of a big omega block with lots of hot wind blowing at the same time that May wildfires were starting. So the area burned was much greater. But again, if you look at the long-term averages, it's really not getting worse. And if people followed fire smart directions and recommendations, a lot of fires probably wouldn't happen. And if we look at yourenvironment.ca, let's just take a quick peek at Toronto and the temperature in January. Doesn't seem to be any trend colder, and the same in February. Oh, there's a blip here, but overall, there's no trend. And how about summer? Is it hotter? Well, again, doesn't seem to be a trend upward. Again, a blip, but, 1 year is an anomaly. It's not a statistical source of evidence of a trend. And the same here for August. And how about heat waves? Well, these are when the hottest temperatures were recorded in Canada. And the hottest in 2021 in BC was 49.6 Celsius. In the Northwest Territories, also 2021, 39.9 Celsius. But all the other provinces, 2004 for the Yukon, for Nunavut, was in 1989, Alberta 1931, Saskatchewan 1937, Manitoba 1936, Ontario 1975, Quebec 1921, Newfoundland and Labrador 1921, Prince Edward Island 1935, and the same for New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. So, doesn't seem to be a trend in heat waves there. And how about flooding? Well, we have this presentation on the flooding in Toronto in 2024, and Robert Muir, professional engineer, provided a lot of information to us on that, and he shows how cities have paved over wetlands and runoff areas. So the perception is that there's more precipitation and more flooding, but really the runoff areas have been restricted. Not to mention, there's also been a dramatic growth in population, and the floodways are under capacity. So, having a carbon tax or a price on carbon or putting up wind farms or solar panels will not address any of these issues. But you might say, what of insured losses? And here's Roger Pielke Jr., the honest broker. He makes the point, don't use economic data to assess climate trends. Use climate data. And why is that? Because back in 1984, the type of buildings we were building were much more modest than those we've built more recently. So when there's damage to these buildings, of course the losses will be higher. And extreme weather events are not climate change. We have quite a few presentations on our website. Principally, Madhav Kandekar does a long, detailed presentation, but he's got a few shorter ones about this as well. So it's problematic that Abacus data is asking, how concerned are you about the impact of extreme weather events in your area over the next few years, and correlating it to climate change, because they're not related. Climate is something that's measured over 30, 50, 100 millennial timescales. Extreme weather events are integral to climate. And are we in a climate crisis or climate emergency or climate catastrophe? And Dr. Matthew Wilicki has taken the IPCC chart here, and he shows that climate change has had virtually no effect on any of these extreme events. And if you want to read more, please look at our report, Do People Cause Floods? Tell Me No Lies. This is on our blog. It's by Robert Lyman. And this graph is in this report. You can have a closer look at it. So, based on these findings, how do you believe the Canadian government should approach climate change in relation to economic growth? The Abacus data folks say that Canadians want balance and not sacrifice. So that sounds good, but really better to ask, how much are you willing to pay for climate action? And the answer is, from a survey in the States, 1% of income. That's what 40% of the people surveyed said. So if we did that, according to Stats Canada, the median Canadian income in 2022 was $43,000. So 1% of that would be $431. But the total federal and provincial expenditures on climate measures over the period 2020 to 2030 are going to be $476 billion, or $11,900 per resident of Canada. That equates to roughly $28,000 per household, or an average of $2,800 per household per year. So that's quite a bit more than $431, but you're already committed to this. You didn't know that, probably. So the real question should be, do you know how much you are paying today? It's way more than $431. And if you look at this Western Standard article, it summarizes the key points from these three reports. These reports are on our blog, but if you just want the quick overview, you can see that climate policy is costing us, as I mentioned, $476 billion or $11,900 per resident of Canada over the period of 2020 to 2030. And that's only what's been announced. Now that we have Mr. Carney in office as Prime Minister, who has a much more stringent climate agenda based on his book Values, there's 5 more fiscal years before 2030, and governments may add more initiatives. And there's also contracts for differences, which is in this report. So this is one example of a contract for difference, which is kind of a guarantee for renewables producers that they will not lose out in any way. So the support here, the subsidy here, works out to a carbon tax equivalent of $1,167.58 per ton. So again, you're paying that, but you don't know it. And about reaching net zero, well, the net zero challenge ranges between 2 trillion and 5.2 trillion. And that's almost an unimaginable amount of money. 2 trillion is 50,000 for every one of Canada's 40 million residents, or $118,000 for every household. 5.2 trillion is $130,000 for every resident, or $306,000 for every household. Averaged over 27 years, 2 trillion would cost every one of today's residents about $1,850 per year, or if it happened to be 5.2 trillion, it would cost everyone $4,815 per year. Huge sums of money. These things are all being done, and you're probably not even aware of it. So, Abacus data asks the question, how effectively do you think the Liberal government is addressing climate change today? And really, the question should be, do you know how effective current climate policy is in reaching Canadian GHG reduction targets? Because that's the whole point, right? Why have climate policies and incentives, subsidies, regulations, if you're not going to reach the targets? So let's look and see. Here's a few reports you can look at. So this is the economic impact and GHG effects of the federal government's emissions reduction plan through 2030. So we're only going up to 2030. So we're emitting up here, and the intention is by 2026, that's a year away, to drop down this much. And you can see that all these past years we have not dropped except during the COVID lockdowns. And even then, not much. And then the further objective by 2030 is to come down to here. So I'll let you read all these numbers here yourself, but if we met these targets, the global average temperature would be reduced by 0.007 degrees Celsius. That's 7 thousandths of a degree Celsius as of 2100, compared to the case if Canada does nothing. So this is an immeasurable amount of temperature. We also have another piece on our blog called Getting to Net Zero in Canada that looks at the Canadian Energy Regulator forecasts and plans for how to get there, and also contrasts it with a report by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And really the upshot is what the ministers desperately don't want is to tell the public that fulfilling their government's net zero agenda will entail a quarter century of ever more energy and economic deprivation. And then there's a report by energy expert Vaclav Smil. He says net zero is not likely, and you can see why. So this was 2022, and this is supposed to be 2050. So it's called halfway between Kyoto and 2050. Zero carbon is a highly unlikely outcome, and he's just issued this book in French. We do have a version of a summary in French and English that's available, and that's also available on our blog. So 4 key points from Vaclav Smil's report that I picked out, there are other key points that he makes. These are ones I thought most pertinent to our discussion today. The share of fossil fuels in the global energy consumption has only decreased from nearly 86% in 1997 to about 82% in 2022. And even though we've had all of these agreements and spent trillions of dollars, he also points out that the transition from biomass fuels like wood and charcoal to fossil fuels started more than 2 centuries ago, but it's still incomplete. Billions of people still rely on traditional biomass for cooking and heating. And also, the scale of today's energy transition requires approximately 700 exajoules of new non-carbon energies by 2050, which needs about 38,000 projects the size of BC's Site C Dam, or 39,000 equivalents of Muskrat Falls. So that's just not going to happen. And finally, to achieve net zero carbon, affluent countries will incur costs of at least 20% of their annual GDP. And furthermore, there's no material supply chain that exists to support this transition. And this is a report by Robert Lyman called The Pursuit of the Impossible. He's talking about the materials constraints and the realities for net zero utopia. He focuses primarily on the EV issue here, but he's basing it on the work of Dr. Simon Michaud, who did this incredibly comprehensive 1,000-page report. But really, this is all people need to know. What Dr. Michaud did is he took the amount of minerals, and these are critical minerals necessary for the energy transition. He took the amount mined in 2019 and basically extrapolated it out to what we would need and how long would it take us to do that. This is to produce one generation of technology units to phase out fossil fuels. So for copper, it would take 189 years, nickel 400 years, lithium 9,920 years, cobalt 1,733 years. So you get the picture. It's just not going to happen. And then Abacus Data asks, what do you want the Canadian government to prioritize in its climate change policies over the next few years? Select up to 3 priorities. So one says increased investment in renewable energy and clean technology. That's 42%. That's pretty significant. Improved infrastructure to withstand extreme weather events, 31%. Greater collaboration with provinces and territories on climate goals, 29%. So what should be the government's climate priorities? Well, probably transparency. Do Canadians know they will be spending billions of dollars for perhaps a 0.007 degrees Celsius difference 80 years from now? And actually, renewables will not reduce oil, natural gas, and coal demand. They will amplify it. Because, as pointed out in this article from 2016 by Vaclav Smil in the IEEE Spectrum, renewables require vast quantities of oil, natural gas, and coal for production, installation, and operation. More mining and processing is required, and mining presently uses 10% of global energy. So you're not going to see any decline in fossil fuel use if you build out more renewables. And finally, the upshot by Abacus Data. And they say that avoiding public numbness remains a strategic imperative if heat domes, smoke advisories, and flood alerts become annual background noise. Psychological calluses could form even as objective danger grows. Well, I've shown you that that's not happening. The antidote is to keep the narrative personal and local. So they're suggesting that politicians and advocates for climate action should link carbon policy to the cost of cooling an apartment during a week-long heat emergency or the premium hike after a basement flood. Framing climate risk in these everyday terms resonates with the cost of living lens that defines the precarity mindset and prevents the issue from slipping into abstraction fatigue. Well, in my view, Abacus data offers a false and misleading conclusion, and they're greenwashing climate action. Carbon policies and climate action won't stop floods, heat domes, or wildfires, but will drive up the cost of living for no climate or environmental benefit and will cause much personal and national economic harm. So we invite you to join us in the race from net zero. You can have a look at our activities online, and you can also join Friends of Science. Become a member and get all of our information in your mailbox. We invite you to also get a copy of our booklet, Energy and Climate at a Glance, 22 prominent climate topics. These facts are just laid out in a very simple, straightforward way, and you can get it on our website. So I hope you take some insights from this presentation and recognize how these pollsters tend to manipulate the information they're providing, and they're not always coming from the factual basis that's out there, from an evidentiary basis. So it's important that you have a look at this with a critical eye and ask questions like, how many people agreed to this or that in the survey? Sometimes the survey statistics are not really clear, and as you've noted, and I've noted, they will often package things together to try and come up with the bigger figure, which is not exactly representative of what people said or thought. But most important, you're paying way too much for climate action already, and it's not effective. It's not going to change a thing. So take that into consideration as you look at what kind of policies are being presented. And many of these climate policies can be cut, and that would reduce our expenses and our debt significantly. So as we go forward with an ever-increasing federal deficit, this is where Canadians need to be informed about the burdensome cost of this climate ideology. Thanks for watching. I'm Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science.